I'm very pleased to introduce Jessica Grove-Smith, who's a senior scientist and researcher at the Passive House Institute. Jessica, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Very happy to be here today at this very exciting event. There seems to be a lot happening in New York at the moment regarding Passive House, regarding energy efficiency, and it's great to see such a big movement and to be part of it. So I'm very happy to be able to share with you what's kind of happening on an international basis from the background of the Passive House Institute in Germany. There's two things I want to talk about mainly today, and one is a brief overview of where we all started and where we are at now internationally, the Passive House standard. And the other aspect is something that's coming up, or has come up very recently. We are introducing Passive House classes, some of you might have heard of, where we've incorporated energy efficiency and renewable energies. So that's the second part of my presentation, preparing passive houses, or combining passive houses, renewable energy. How do we rate that? What are the passive house classes, passive house plus and premium? So starting from the very beginning, passive house in a nutshell, what passive house really is about. This will be familiar for most of you, and I don't want to throw around the very basics. But basically it's about increasing comfort, health and quality. So we're talking about very high quality buildings that last for a very long time. At the same time, we're doing this at very low costs, talking about life cycle costs essentially, and very low energy consumption. It was very nice to hear the presentation from Sebastian earlier, who gave a lot of examples, great examples from Belgium and internationally, showing exactly how costs is not a problematic factor when we're talking about building passive houses. So essentially, what it is about, the standard is that you optimize your building components, you optimize the building envelope, and you do that to the extent that the heating system or the cooling system becomes really, really simple. So you might have an additional investment, you might have additional costs for the envelope, but then you can save on the other side, and you can have a really simple and robust cooling and heating system. Take you back a little bit in time. The very first passive house was built 24 years ago, so we're nearing the anniversary of 25 years. It started with research in 1988, like late 1980s, by Professor Wolfgang Feist, who then founded the institute a couple of years later. 1990 was the construction, and 1991 4 families moved in. You see here on the picture, that is the first passive house that's still standing in Darmstadt. It's 4 units, row houses, about 1,700 square feet treated floor area. The passive house has been monitored very intensely since then. It was an example project. It was an experiment. A lot of research and ideas had gone into it. It was put into practice to see, does this really perform? Are we meeting our expectations? It's been monitored very closely ever since, and you can see on this graph, this is data for 22 years, and you can see that the heating consumption has been as low as, or below 3 kilobitu's per square feet a year ever since. So on the very left-hand side, the red bar is what you'd expect for a low-energy house. Then the first year, there were still some adjustments that had to be made, but ever since, the performance has been great. So that was the first example showing that it worked, the idea put into practice, and then it went from there, basically. Passive houses were being promoted, passive houses were being built in other countries, other locations. What you see here is one of the first main European projects where passive house was built to a bigger scale, and passive houses were built throughout Europe, and they were being monitored very intensely. And what you can see is that what these projects demonstrate is that an energy savings of 90% that we'd predicted beforehand were achieved also in practice. So just showing that passive houses do work. It wasn't just an idea, just a fantasy. Coming from there, we now have passive houses tried and tested, tried and true worldwide. This is a map of certified passive houses. So we're talking about almost 10,000 passive house units certified worldwide. 10,000 certified, yes, worldwide. Passive houses don't necessarily have to be certified. You can also build a passive house without giving it that last quality stamp. Of course, then it's difficult to keep track of how many passive houses there are, because we don't have these numbers. Not everybody who builds a passive house has come to us and says, oh, I have a passive house. So there's an estimate of around 50,000 passive house units worldwide. And you can see the orange blob in the middle in Europe, that's still where the main activity is. That's where it has been for the longest time, but it's coming worldwide. Asia is a lot happening there, and especially here in the US on the eastern coast, which is very exciting. Look a little more closely at the US. Here's a map of certified passive houses, and we're likely to reach 1 million square feet certified passive houses at the end of a year, which is a great number. A special mention at this point is to the Passive House Academy, to one of our partners, one of our international partners, who have been doing a lot of educational and a lot of certification work here in the US, especially in New York. So a lot of those certified projects in the US have gone through them. I've already mentioned it, the passive houses are not necessarily have to be certified. It's an open standard, it's open to all. The intention behind it was, okay, we want better buildings, we want to achieve energy savings. There are no patents, it's not trademarked, it's an open concept. We want people to build passive houses, which has been part of the reason why it's been able to spread throughout the world. Going a little bit more into detail or into numbers, there is a clear definition as to what passive house is. So if you're promising or if you're talking about passive house, then this is what it means. Basically, the functional definition is that I can heat or I can cool my building only by using the air that I have anyway for fresh air. So I have to bring in fresh air in terms of air quality to provide the occupants with fresh air. And that's a certain amount of air I need, and if I just heat that air, that should be enough to keep my building warm or to keep it cool. That translates into certain numbers, which is the famous 4.75 kilo BTUs or 15 kilowatt hours that we use in Europe in the SI units. Or it translates to the functional criteria, which is the 3.2 kilo BTUs per hour square feet as heating load. Similarly, we have criteria for the cooling demand, which is climate dependent, again, because it's a functional criteria. And if you get to very hot climates that are hot and humid throughout the year, and if you're constantly cooling them through that fresh air, through the maximum cooling load, the energy demand that you have over the course of the year will vary, will be higher in some climates than in others. The other main criteria is the air tightness. We have to go below 0.6 air changes an hour, and then there's the total primary energy demand. I don't want to go into detail at this stage. What I do want to point out is it's international, right? So we're going back to this functional definition of a passive house, where it's come from. And what you see here is a map of the world where we've run through climate data, and we've modeled an example passive house that performs as with this functional criteria. So it confirms these 3.2, or it's below the heating load of 3.2 BTUs per hours per square feet. And what you can see that there are, in the red regions here on the world map, there are regions where if you fulfill this functional criteria, your actual heating demand might be slightly higher than the 4.75s that you would expect in the European climates or in the climate here. Similarly for cooling, this is the criteria for cooling worldwide. So in most regions it is the 4.75 as a maximum criteria for cooling demand. It does rise, as I mentioned, in climates that are extremely hot and humid throughout the year, and it goes up to a maximum of 24 kilo BTUs per square feet a year as an absolute limiting criteria. Now a passive house has to be optimized for the climate that we're in. That's the purpose of it all. We look at where we are, we optimize the building to reduce the energy demand. And obviously the components to achieve that will have to be different everywhere in the world. So what we've developed over the years, over the experience that we've gathered, is guidelines for different climate zones. So we categorize basically the world into 7 climate zones, ranging from Arctic, so very cold, to very hot. And within these climate zones, you would expect similar component qualities, so similar levels of insulation or similar glazing types. It's not saying that in these climate zones you have to have a certain type of glazing to be able to achieve the passive house standards. These are recommendations, so you know basically where you're starting. Every building is different, and you have to optimize your building to reach the target values, essentially. So what are we talking about in terms of optimizing the envelope? Many of you will be very familiar with this graph and with the contents. Mainly, there are 3 categories three things we're talking about in the building. One is the opaque envelope, so the insulation, avoiding thermal bridges, and air tightness is an extremely important factor in terms of the building physics. Here's an example from New York. It's a thermal image. It's a tight house from Fabrica 718 from Julie Moskowitz, who's here in the audience, a great project. I was lucky enough to visit it yesterday. And you can see that the insulation it performs, it's one great aspect of, one really important aspect of passive houses. A second aspect are the transparent elements, the windows. In cool climates, we talk about triple glazing. It can be different depending on where you are. So going back to these climate zones that I mentioned on my previous slides, if you go further south in the US to warmer climates, you might need double glazing, only need double glazing at some point to reach the target value of 4.75. Whereas if we go north towards Canada, you might need even improved triple glazing up to quadruple glazing to reach the comfort criteria and the passive house standard. Last but certainly not least, we have the mechanical systems, mainly the ventilation, with heat recovery or with energy recovery, depending on whether you're in a humid climate. Worth pointing out is the summer comfort, which is really, really important. The main approaches would be to reduce your exterior loads, so basically in terms of heat and humidity, so through shading, for example. Reduce your interior loads. It's a really important aspect to keep those in mind. So look at all your plug loads, look at the efficiency of the appliances. Everything that you have inside in terms of your loads, you have to cool out. So that's also part of the concept to bring those down, to ramp up the efficiency in terms of appliances. Use passive means wherever possible. So look back at natural ventilation. Open the window if you can, rather than turning on the air conditioning. And then last step is to implement efficient cooling technology, preferably with dehumidification and cooling separately. What you see here on this graph is the comparison of an existing building and a passive house building in terms of the cooling dynamics, which I always find very, very interesting and a bit of an eye-opener, because it shows how differently a passive house behaves or is in terms of its dynamics. So what you see here is it's a calculation, dynamic calculation on an hourly basis. What you see here is the cooling load over the course of a week. So you see, very typical, we have cooling peaks every single day. So during the middle of the day, the temperature goes up, the sun shines very strongly, and we have immense cooling peaks that we have to provide in order to keep the buildings cool, which is an immense pressure on the utilities or on the energy providers. It looks extremely different for a passive house. Not only is it on a much lower level, the cooling load that we need to provide, but it's also much, much more stable. And that's part of the dynamics of the passive house. That's thanks to us having optimized the building envelope, having the mechanical systems, having the shading in place. The dynamics change completely, which makes the building much more robust and much more easy to handle in an overall context. All of this applies not only to single-family homes, but also to non-residential buildings or larger buildings. We saw many project examples earlier. It also applies to retrofit projects, so to refurbishments. Many projects have been implemented. What we see here is an example from Germany. On the right-hand side, we have an image of the old building where the consumption was still 92 kilobitu's per square feet a year. After the refurbishment, it had gone down to 4.5. Worth pointing out is that we have a second standard, so retrofits don't necessarily meet the targets of passive house. Also in this example, it's not 4.75, but a little bit higher. So there's a second standard which we call NFIT, and that was introduced mainly because of the recognition that you have some difficulties, you can have some constraints in existing buildings that hinder you from pushing it quite as far as passive house. Air tightness, for example, is more difficult to reach. So the target for air tightness is a little bit higher in retrofit projects. So to account for that, there's the second standard, which is NFIT. Talking about NFIT and talking about refurbishments, something that's been very relevant is talking about step by step. So you might not have the option of retrofitting your project all at once. You might have the vision, you'll have the idea, but you don't have the financial possibilities, or maybe your windows were only done 2 years ago and it seems a waste to replace them again. So something that we've been looking at within the context of a European project, Eurofit, with a lot of partners, is step by step towards the NFIT standard. And what you see down here is an example of a project in the UK, in England, and this is kind of taking different measures from the existing down to what the long-term goal is. And what we're going to introduce, or what we're working on introducing, is kind of doing a certification platform where you can register these different steps you intend to take, and you get your you get this certification process or this step-by-step process validated or approved in a way. It's important that if you improve one component, it's already prepared for when you're doing the next step at a later point in time. For retrofit, or generally for passive house, if you do it right. It's a wasted opportunity if you go in and change something and you haven't taken the full potential or used the full potential, because you won't change it 2 years down the road. So if you do it, definitely do it right. So we have these two standards, Passive House and NFIT, for new build and for renovation. What we do at the Passive House Institute in Darmstadt in Germany is we do research and quality assurance mainly. So basically we've been safeguarding and promoting the standard since 1996 when the institute was founded, and we try to put forward, we work together with our partners to put forward solutions when we're facing new situations, like for example the step-by-step refurbishment or different types of buildings. We're involved in all sorts of different areas. The big green part, or one of the main parts, is research work. We also work a lot with manufacturers or with architects, designers, so in training or in product development or communications, all sorts of different parts. There's a lot to do. Passive House is a huge field, keeping us extremely busy, and the world is very big. A lot of people to talk to. And we don't want to do it all on our own, especially since people working in a specific country, they have experience on the local construction industry, they have experience with how things are handled. So we have founded the International Passive House Association, and the International Passive House Association works with partners or affiliates worldwide. So we have almost 3,000 members worldwide in more than 50 countries. And 18 affiliates. So we have affiliate partner organizations, which in the US is New York Passive House, and then Passive House California on the West Coast, and then also in Canada, Canfi. So those are the main organizations that we work with, and their members automatically become members of the international network to exchange experience and exchange ideas. That's how the Passive House Institute in Darmstadt is basically connected or shares the experience with the world. This is a screenshot of the website of the International Passive House Association, which is one of the platforms that members or non-members have access to, and where a lot of information and experience is exchanged. One of the things, for example, is that we have a collection of passive house legislation. So cities or region moving forward and saying, we've adopted passive house, we want to be pioneers, we want to, as a city, be exemplary and promote passive house. So there's a couple of countries where this has happened. Austria, Belgium, we saw. Brussels is a very a front runner in this regard. And then there's also the US. Ken mentioned it earlier today. One city built to last, so it's very exciting that this is also happening in New York. And it'll be interesting, New York has already started connecting and networking between all these other regions to exchange experience and see how to best move forward with this approach. It's often easier to make a decision and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build passive house, like Sebastian was saying earlier. For Brussels, the decision was made maybe by people who didn't exactly know what they were going into. Our experience shows that the key to success, once you've made this decision, or one really important aspect, is quality assurance. So once you've made this decision, you have to make sure that it's being carried through, and that the buildings that are being built to passive house, so that you're wanting to being built, or that you're requiring to be built as passive house, really achieve what you want them to. In terms of quality assurance, there are different aspects. One is training and basically capacity building on different levels, mainly for designers, consultants, architects, also for craftsmen, where we have international certification schemes I see quite a familiar faces in the room who are certified passive house designers. So again, this is an international capacity building approach. Really, really important is the quality assurance of components. So to have the components available in the quality that you need to achieve the standard. One aspect of it is identifying which parameters are important of these components, and then having testing procedures to say, okay, or independent testing procedures that prove that the values that the manufacturers are giving you are actually true, that the component is going to perform the way that the manufacturer is promising. We have different certification approaches, different categories for the envelope or for windows or for mechanical systems, and the numbers have been going up rapidly. We have over 600 certified components worldwide nowadays. One of the reasons why this is so important, because it has a big influence on costs of a passive house. What you see here is the effects of the learning curve and the component availability for passive house in the early days, basically, after the first passive house was built. It's the cost per square meter, additional costs, additional investment costs, and you can see that it was quite high for the first prototype passive houses, and then it's continuously gone down. And main aspects was the learning curve, so understanding what it was all about. Second aspect was actually having the components available at reasonable prices. Costs is a big discussion, and I think Sebastian brought it across very nicely in his presentation this morning, so I'm not going to go into much more detail. It's a lot more about making decisions and knowing what you're doing than saying passive house is necessarily definitely going to be more expensive than something else. But that's only going to work if the components are available. The way it works with the component certification or component development is that we work very closely with the manufacturer, so the manufacturer might provide an idea. We evaluate it, we talk to them, we look at the criteria met or how can it possibly be improved, and then it goes back to the manufacturer, and that way we develop products. What is highly relevant for the US and still fairly new and in the making is that we are now looking at split units, and we're going to see if we can get kind of certification criteria or input on how to evaluate the performance, reliably evaluate the performance of split units. In terms of components in the US, there's not that many yet, which is a bit of a shame. So any manufacturer here in the room or everybody else, I'd encourage you strongly to take up on that. There are 3 certified windows in the US, which you can see here on this screen. And I'm very, very happy, as Ken has already announced this morning, that we have a new system. Chris is here also in the back of the audience, and we're going to give him the certificate during the lunch break. So very excited to have this new component certified in the US, which Chris is going to present in the next session as well, if you're interested in more details. The third aspect for quality assurance is the quality assurance in terms of design and construction. So having reliable design, relying on the tools that you're using, and then possibly also certification at the end to give you the stamp and say, okay, it complies with the standard. The passive house planning package, the PHPP, is now available in 20 languages in 30 countries. It's tried and tested, so we definitely know that it gives you accurate performance predictions. It's an invaluable planning and validation tool, and what you can look forward to is that we're continuously developing this. We've just recently released the version PHPP 9 in German, and it's going to be released in English in October for the North American Passive House Conference. It includes all sorts of exciting new things. One that's been very promising is that we have variant calculation. So you can use one PHPP file, one model of your building, and assess different variations of that building. So say, for example, a different quality of the window or different retrofit steps, and you can do that all at the same time with the same PHPP file. Design PHPP is an Excel tool, and it's not easy in terms of inputting your design in the first stage, and we are quite aware that that's not the way that architects usually work during the design process. So Design PH has been developed as a connection between or interface between doing 3D design with SketchUp and then importing that into PHPP, and that's been very popular. What you see here are some example projects that have been modeled in Design PH. I wanted to point out the project database, passivhausprojekte.de. The website is German, or the name of the website is in German, but once you're on there, you can switch to English. It's really inspiring to go to this website and just click through. You can filter by country, or you can filter by size of the project, or you can filter by type of building. And basically, it's a collection of passive houses built worldwide. They're not necessarily all certified as passive houses, and not all certified passive houses are included in the database, because it's always up to the architect whether they want to include it, or the owner whether they want to include it or not. But it's great to get some inspiration and some idea of what's happening in terms of projects worldwide. Just a few pictures to show you. The passive house is not only residential, it's not only small. Here's some pictures of passive house schools that have been built, passive house kindergartens, passive house gyms are quite popular, very popular in Germany. So all public, or a lot of public buildings, schools especially with gyms in Germany, it's standard. It's just what you do. You build them to passive house. Offices are larger buildings, but also built to passive house standard very frequently. 2012, the first office tower was built to passive house standard in Austria. We also have large-scale ENERFIT projects. So this, for example, is the university in Innsbruck. What you see on the right-hand side is what it looked like before. It was in desperate need of renovation. And on the left-hand side, it's the ENERFIT after refurbishment. And they had it's a university, so they had the possibility to put in some additional research work and see how to find the best solutions. And they got some quite clever concepts on how to deal with the situation of it being an office, or it being an office building with high plug loads, and natural ventilation, for example. So they were able to design some windows that improve the passive ventilation concept. So looking at projects like these and maybe extracting ideas for your own projects is very, very helpful. A lot happening international. This is a passive house project in Japan. And China is really taking off at the moment. China is really interesting because it has also very different climates. There's hot and humid. There's also extremely cold. And what's been built in China is usually very big. So it's been quite a challenge, but it's been really interesting, especially dealing also with, the different cultures, the different approaches, the different construction industry. Here are some examples of projects that have been certified as passive houses through us. The one on the top left is actually a hotel. So if you want to go to Shanghai and test out a passive house, that's where you go. And bigger buildings in other parts of China. What kind of building types are we talking about that have already been built to passive house? The question always is, can we build everything as a passive house, or do we at some point hit constraints and say, what do I do? How do I achieve these energy savings? Archives have been built as passive houses, so these are some examples that have been implemented. Dental clinics, labs, retails and supermarkets, swimming pools, hospitals. They have been built as passive houses, but it's not quite as straightforward. So for all of these, there has been some additional research work involved, and then we had some pilot projects to monitor or to show how to implement it into practice. Okay, that was an overview in terms of what's happening internationally so far. What I want to talk about next is energy efficiency and renewable energies. There's been a lot of talk, or very popular word that people always come up with is net zero, plus energy homes. What does all this mean, and where are we aiming? What do we recommend in terms from the Passive House Institute? What our approach, or what's our stand on these things? And things are changing, or have changed, because we've recognized this is something really important in terms of the sustainable future. And we have to incorporate this when we're building passive houses or when we're designing passive houses. We have to make these passive houses fit for the future of a renewable energy supply. So passive house, the very foundation of passive house is not changing. That's still exactly the same. It's the functional definition that I explained to you earlier. So we have the heating demand, the cooling demand, and the air tightness, basically. So those are the really hard criteria. That is what defines passive house, and that's not going to change. that definitely stays the same. There's a second criteria for passive house when you're planning or designing or certifying a passive house, which is the overall efficiency, which so far has been the non-renewable primary energy demand. So the PE demand, which is set at 38 kilo BTUs per square feet in a year. And that includes household electricity, it includes your domestic hot water. So basically it's an overall limit on how much primary energy your building is allowed to consume. And that was introduced in order to encourage people to use efficient appliances on one hand side, but also to use equipment, heating equipment, cooling equipment, with sustainable or with efficient solutions. That's shifting. We're shifting away from this primary energy approach or primary energy criteria to something called PER. So it's rather than PE, PER, which stands for renewable primary energy demand, and the new limit is going to be 19 kilo BTUs per square feet in a year. Now you might think we're just cutting it in half, we're making it harder, it's going to be more difficult to build passive houses. It's not. These PE and PER aren't directly comparable. It's a completely different thing. One, we are talking about non-renewable primary energy, so fossil fuels essentially, whereas in the new system we're talking about renewable primary energy. We're talking about solar, we're talking about wind, we're talking about biomass, okay? So what's happening in the world is that we are shifting from fossil fuels, we're shifting from this not sustainable energy supply within solvable problems towards sustainable energy supply with solvable challenges. It's definitely happening. It's happening worldwide. The G7 summit last week, they committed to it again and said, okay, we are going to go towards renewable energy supply, which is a great thing. I think it's definitely part of the sustainable future, part of sustainable solutions. But we have to face the fact that we do have some challenges. Renewable energy isn't available for free. And it's not available in unlimited resources. We do have to be careful how we manage the space that we have available. So facing this situation, moving away from non-renewable primary energy to primary energy, the existing criteria with PE just rates renewable energy as being a freebie. So it just ignores all these it rates it as free. So we needed a system where we can rate kind of the sustainability in the context of this renewable energy supply. So the new approach based on PER, basically what we're doing is we're setting our buildings into a future scenario where we only have a renewable primary energy supply, including all storage facilities. And the reason for doing that is basically we're building for a future. It's happening, it's definitely going that way. And buildings that we build today, that we design today, need to perform sustainably in future conditions, right? We're not building buildings that we're going to tear down in 10 years. They'll hopefully stand for a little bit longer. So we need to optimize them for that future. And the way that this scenario looks like is that on the left-hand side, we have basically our renewable energy supply, which is mainly electricity. So it's PV, it's wind, and it's hydropower as main sources. And then on the other hand side, we have our building with the energy demand, with the energy load. And there's a certain amount of energy that I can transfer directly from the energy supply to the energy demand side. It's fine. It's available when I need it at the building. There are, however, times where I have a demand and I don't have the energy available at the same time. So I have to go via storage to be able to make that energy available in my buildings. There are a lot of storage facilities, short-term storage facilities available, like, for example, batteries or pumped storage, things like that. And they have an efficiency of, say, around 80%. So we lose 20% of our original renewable primary energy, which is depicted on the left-hand side. However, this short-term storage is limited in terms of capacity. So what we also need is a long-term storage, something that will be able to help us store the energy from one season to another. In Germany, specifically from summer to winter. Here, it'd be more from spring to summer or from autumn to winter to cover the high peak demands when you have cooling or when you have a heating demand in the building. And the way we've envisioned it is through gas as a storage. That seems to be the most promising. So basically, it's a chemical storage. We transform the electricity into gas, and then transform it back into electricity when we need it at the building. And that has an overall efficiency of only 30%, so 70% losses. So you can immediately see from this graph that everything we can use directly is fine, it's no problem. Short-term storage, the losses are still manageable, but everything that we have to store over a season becomes problematic because it has a lot of losses involved. And that's not only specific to this technology. So whatever technology might be implemented, and I'm sure it'll be a mix of things, everything that involves long-term storage will involve significant losses. So the PER factor that we're introducing is basically it's the fraction of the renewable energy supply on the left-hand side divided by the final energy demand on the right-hand side. So meaning if I need 1 unit of energy at my building, in order to supply that over the course of the year, I might need 1.5 energy supply, renewable primary energy supply on the other side, because I have all the losses in terms of the storage before I can actually bring it to the building. Here's an example of a calculation for New York, an exemplary calculation over the course of the year. So what you see here is an entire year in terms of daily values. In black is the energy load, so that's the demand we have at the building. You can see we have a peak in winter for heating, and then we have a peak in summer for cooling and dehumidification. The colorful lines at the bottom, we have a certain amount of hydropower, which is available in the US, and then we have a certain amount of wind and a certain amount of solar. There's more solar available in summer. Wind is more constantly throughout the year, but we have periods with more wind and less wind. And this is based on hourly climate data, basically. And we did these kind of calculations for almost 1,000 locations worldwide to see how kind of the energy supply and the energy demand match up. What you can see in this example is that we have overall for a passive house, including domestic hot water and including all my electricity demand, including the heating, including the cooling, it's actually quite a large proportion that I can use directly. There's a certain amount that I can buffer with short-term storage, but there is definitely a part that I have to do via the long-term, via the seasonal storage. And you might say, that's not a lot, I'm sure we can just do without, but you can't, because that's exactly the energy that we need to keep the buildings warm or to keep them cold in summer. So that's a really crucial part of the energy demand, and we can't do without it. So basically what the PER factor is, or the PER demand, is that it's an indicator of your required renewable energy resources. It shows you how much do I have to input to be able to cover my consumption at the building. It's a weighting factor for sustainability in that sense, because it's giving me an indication of how much space or how much energy do I need to tap. It's in a future scenario, but it's valid also today because A, we are building for the future, that's what we are facing, and B, we already have renewable energies in the grid or in the mix today, and this system is already valid for these renewable energy approaches. The conventional primary energy approach with non-renewable primary energy is still, it has its reasons and it has its advantages. It's really relevant in terms of an environmental impact factor. So basically, the PE will help for you as an assessment to say, in today's energy supply scenario, I have a negative environmental impact of, or to a certain extent. But it doesn't help you to optimize your building in terms of a sustainable energy supply. So typical values for these PER factors would be 1.3 for electricity, for hot water. It's around 1.7 for heating, and it's around 1 for cooling and dehumidification if you're in a climate that's dominant in terms of heating demand. It's around 1.5 if you're in a climate where cooling becomes relevant. So you can see, just looking at these numbers, that for heating it's the most critical. Heating involves the highest losses. So every unit of energy that I want to use for heating, I have a lot of energy losses involved. Second would be the cooling in cooling-dominated climates, and then not so important is the electricity or the hot water, simply because it's available or the demand is throughout the year, so it's mainly the short-term storage I can use to cover these. And you can see simply by looking at these factors that it becomes extremely relevant to focus on energy efficiency, mainly for heating and for cooling. So we're putting a focus on these two factors. What I've spoken about so far, or what the factors involve mainly in the first stage, is electricity. So we're talking about renewable primary energy, electricity from wind, solar, and hydropower, and then the PER factors that I showed you on the previous slide. There are, of course, other renewable sources that are being put to use and that are great. For example, biomass or solar thermal. There's a difference, though, between the electricity and between these renewable sources, because they're mainly secondary energy use, or they're more easily storable, right? So they have to be rated a little bit differently to the electricity, which I only have at certain times. We do account for these renewable energy sources directly in the PHPP. It becomes a bit complicated to explain it in more detail, but basically what we take into account is aspects like competition for sustainable use. So for example, biomass. If everybody used biomass to an unlimited extent, we'd have a problem because it's being needed for food, it's being needed for fuels. So there's a limit as to how much biomass you can use at your building site for it to be a sustainable solution. So all this is going into the new assessment criteria of primary energy renewable in the PHPP. So what we're doing is we have introduced Passive House classes. At the very bottom, we have the Passive House Classic. Second, we have the Passive House Plus. And third, we have the Passive House Premium. And these three, on one hand side, they differ in terms of their overall efficiency. So for the Passive House Classic, we have a total PER demand of 19 kilobDUs per square feet a year, whereas for a Plus or a Premium, your overall efficiency is higher. And the way to achieve that overall efficiency is basically by using more efficient or more sustainable energy supply systems. So similar to the PE that we've had so far, but in a different rating context. If this is becoming too complicated and you say, why are we doing all this? The Passive House is good as it is. Why do we have to go even further in terms of energy efficiency? Passive House Classic is Passive House Classic. So if you want to go with Passive House as it's been going so far, that's great. It's Passive House. That's definitely the way to go. Plus and Premium are kind of bonuses for those people who say, but I want to be better, I want to be even higher, I want to be even better. There's another side to it, and I've been promising to talk about renewable energy supply, on-site supply, net zero plus energy. So these Passive House classes also include renewable energy generation. Passive House Classic, as it stands today, we don't require any energy generation, renewable energy generation. Efficiency is the most important factor. You don't require every passive house to have on-site energy supply. But if you want to go to a higher category, if you want to have that bonus label, then you'll have to prove that you have some kind of on-site or nearby renewable energy generation. Now, if you look very carefully at this graph, it's a little bit hidden in the captions, but you'll notice that the efficiency rating is scaled to the treated floor area, as the energy demand, whereas the renewable energy supply is related to the footprint area. So these numbers on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side, they don't directly correlate. So I can't just subtract this number from that number. We're not aiming to have a net zero. We're not aiming to say I got to supply as much on-site as I have a demand, okay? Because that's not the goal. So I want to go in a little more detail to explain why this is the approach. Sebastian also already showed it quite nicely in his example that he had earlier, where he said with the passive house and with the low energy building and how much square footage he would need to be able to supply the area that he would need to be able to cover the energy demand. This is going in a similar direction. So what you see here is an example of a passive house in a heating dominated climate, so in Germany. To cover the energy demand of this building, we would need 440 square feet of PV or wind or any other renewable energy source. And this is for a building of 1,600 square feet treated floor area. And we have a certain amount of storage that we require because we have a surplus energy production in summer and we have a winter gap. We have a gap of that energy supply in winter. If this very same building, same size, is built to low energy standards, we would need much more space or much more renewable energy input, and we would also need much more energy storage, and that becomes very difficult economically on a larger scale for grids or for the energy supply to be able to provide that energy storage. So just simply balancing out your energy demand and your energy supply, it doesn't work out. It doesn't help if I'm only looking at my own project and I'm saying, well, I'm covering exactly what I have over the demand. I come out at zero at the end of the year because you're not taking into account at all the storage facilities or the losses that you have along the way. So it's not helpful. Similarly to what Sebastian showed earlier, this is an example project that's in the process still for Enefit project here in New York, in Brooklyn, where I just did a very brief calculation on the kind of areas we're talking about for PV. It's a multi-story, so it has 7 units on it. So the area, the surface area, the roof area that we have in comparison to the treated floor area is comparatively small. Still, it's a very good building. It's very compact in terms of energy efficiency. This is a great project. So for a passive house, we would need about 1,400 square feet PV to be able to cover the energy demand, and that would be talking about only net zero. If we want to take into account the storage, it would be a little bit more, including also the storage facility, which hasn't been mentioned in this slide. For low energy, we're talking much bigger scale. If you look at the size of the roof, which is 1,200, it becomes difficult even as a passive house. If you don't reach the passive house, if you have a lower energy standard, it becomes impossible to have it on site. Still, this is a really great project, and we don't want to rate it negatively because it can't reach those net zero targets. So keeping that in mind, looking at how do we rate, or how can we rate the renewable energy supply on site. It doesn't work to offsite directly the energy demand and the energy supply, simply because you're not taking into account the space that you actually have available on site to build for your renewable energy supply. So a building, a multi-story, which is much better in terms of energy efficiency, is very hard to build as a net zero, whereas a single family home, it's quite easy, right? In terms of energy efficiency, in terms of sustainable futures, this, however, is the recommended and the much better approach. So what we suggest, or what we've implemented, is that rather than trying to have the net zero, we award the plus or the premium, or we encourage people to use as much of the site that they have available, okay? So we rate the energy supply based on the available space for the specific building. If you want to build more, that's fine, but it doesn't have to be on site, okay? So you're welcome to purchase a wind turbine or to invest in a wind turbine, but try to make as much use of the space that you have available on site. Okay, so basically these are the three different classes. It's very important to remember that passive house stays passive house. We're going to stick with the 4.75. The efficiency has to come first. But then we have the 3 different classes: classic, plus, and premium, if you want to go higher in efficiency and if you want to include renewable energy. And I think we found a very good way to kind of balance out energy efficiency and rate on-site energy efficiency. It's a big topic at the moment. As I said, we just recently introduced it with the PHPP 9 in April, available in English in October. So the first projects are now being built and being certified to these new standards, Passive House Plus and Premium. It's a big event coming up next year because it's 20 years Passive House Institute and it's 25 years of the first Passive House, so big, nice round numbers. So I'd like to invite you, if you have time, if you come to Germany, and to be part of that event and to see these first Passive House Plus and Premium projects, which I'm sure will be presented there. So we've got a long, successful history, and we're definitely fit and ready for the future. Thank you. I think so. How are we doing for time? Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, so the question was, how does EnerFit fit in with these new passive house classes? Very good question. I should have included that in my slides. It applies also to EnerFit. So if EnerFit similarly or the same, we have the criteria. So there's also EnerFit Classic, EnerFit Plus, and EnerFit Premium, with the same criteria for on-site renewable energy production. Okay. Another question? Okay, thank you.